a moral standpoint. Partly he complained about when Jews a theocracy, but he saw Jews as a people and not just a religion. So he wanted to somehow forge a solution that would allow the Jews and the Arabs, as had happened in America with different nationalities, to live together. He also saw that strategically, geopolitically, diplomatically as a necessity, because he believed that if that didn't happen, if you had imposed one or the other, you'd get decades of war and riot and rebellion. And if that happened, the United States might get drawn in. And that, above all, was something that he didn't want. So that was the perspective that Truman brought, those two things. Now, what he set upon trying to do during his first year, from, I guess you could say year and a half, from April 45 to August 1st of 1946, was to fashion a solution with the British that would create either a binational or federated state. And he created with Bevan, the Foreign Secretary of Britain, something called the British American Committee or Commission. And in late July of 1946, it produced this thing called the Morrison-Grady Plan that Truman himself had overseen. He sent Grady over there, and he was in constant contact with him. And that was a plan for a federation, two different areas, common legislature of the Jews and the Arabs, but the UN would still be centrally in charge through a trustee, perhaps the British, perhaps someone else, until such a time as the two sides could get together and rule each other. So that was Truman's plan. That's what he wanted to see happen in Palestine. Now, what happened was, you have to remember, this is the era when all kinds of things were happening. Truman was embattled politically. The Cold War is beginning. The Israel-Palestine wasn't his central issue by any means. And he became concerned, as did the people in the White House, that that the Democrats were going to lose the election in the fall of 1946. Zionist movement in America at the time was pretty powerful, 100,000, 200,000 people. There had been a lot of divisions among Jews over the idea of a Jewish state, but after the Nazis, after the revelations about the Holocaust, the concentration camps, pretty much all the movements joined ranks in the organizations and were for some form of Jewish state. And they became a very powerful lobby. It's hard to imagine now because the populations were different. Jews in New York was the most important state politically in the country. It was like California or maybe, I guess California now. Florida and Texas come right behind. Jews were the swing vote in New York. If you didn't have that vote, you were going to lose. Maryland, very important. Pennsylvania, Ohio. So during that summer, as Truman, Bevan were trying to forge this plan, there was tremendous pressure on him not to go along with this, to support instead some kind of Jewish state. What Truman finally did was he just threw up his hands and said, I can't do this anymore. He said to the State Department, you take care of it. He said to the British, I can't endorse this plan with you. And from August 1st, roughly August 1st, 1946, through his presidency, Truman acts as a kind of divided man. Truman's reputation, which is derived from the way he conducted the Cold War and the Berlin airlift, is as the guy who said, the buck stops here. He had a plaque on his desk that said that. But when it came to Palestine, the buck always stopped somewhere else. He was just, he withdrew from the issue. He would try to get other people to handle it. And then when the conflict got too intense between the State Department, Zionist lobby, British, he would eventually be drawn in and try to make and would have to make a decision, but reluctantly. And he would complain bitterly afterwards, and then he would withdraw again and come back. And you see this cycle from August 1946 on through his recognition of Israel in May of 1948. Now, one part of Truman, the part of Truman that was, let's say, the private Truman, the Truman who confided in people, who wrote letters, still believed that the Morrison-Grady plan, this kind of federation for Palestine, was the best idea, and that was the way to go. And I'll just read you some things that I discovered when I was looking at his papers. He recognizes the State of Israel in May 14th of 1948. And if you know something about Truman later, or even if you read some of the kind of mythic accounts of him, in the 1950s, he really glories in the idea that he had done it. He compares himself to Cyrus, the Persian king. And he presents himself as somebody who had no qualms. But here's May 15th, a day after he does it, he writes somebody who was a political associate. You, of course, are familiar with all the effort put forth by me to get a peaceable and satisfactory settlement of the Palestine question. I am still hoping for just that. I think the report of the British-American Commission on Palestine was the correct solution, and I think eventually we're going to get it worked out just that way. 3 days later, he again writes a friend. My sole objective in the Palestine procedure has been to prevent bloodshed. The way things look today, we apparently have not been successful. Nobody in this country has given the problem more time and thought than I have. In 1946, when the British-American Commission on Palestine was appointed and Mr. Bevan had made an agreement with me that he would accept the findings of that commission, I thought we had the problem solved. But the emotional Jews of the United States and the equally emotional Arabs in Egypt and Syria prevented that settlement from taking place. So there's one other kind of curious incident that I'll just cite to you. Is in September of that year, which is, 4 months later, a delegation of Jewish war veterans comes to the White House, and they're going to present him with a kind of, he thinks they're going to present him with, it's going to be one of those pro forma visits where they shake hands and he agrees to appear at their convention, but instead Julius Klein, the brigadier general who's the head of it, presents him with this list of demands. And Truman gets very annoyed, and he says to them, and this is again September 1948, he complains that he and Bevan had agreed on the best possible solution for Palestine, and it was the Zionists who killed that plan by their opposition. Now, I say that again because I just want to counter the usual idea of how Truman approached these issues and how he thought about them. Practically speaking, when he did get drawn in, when he did have to make a decision, he would always initially try to make a decision that he thought was fair to both sides. In 1947, the issue gets thrown to the UN. The British throw up their hands and say the UN has to decide what's going to happen. And there's a lot of support for an idea of partition. But the question is, how is the partition going to work? And the proposal that the UN is considering at the time, and the Zionist and American Palestine support, would have roughly been something, and this was the way it ended up too, would have been 56% Jewish, 40% Arab, and the rest international religious places supervised by the UN. Now, at the time, in 1947, Palestine was still 70% Arab and 30% Jewish. So you can understand from that why the Arabs were very unhappy. Truman and his Secretary of State Marshall tried to present at that point a compromise that would have given the Negev desert, that desert that goes down to the Arab side, and the proportions would have been more equal. But again, there was a big outcry, and he finally threw up his hands, and it was 56-40, and there was a war. And as an aftermath of the war, the division is 78% Jewish, 22% Arab, Palestinian, but that 22% comes under the control of Jordan and Egypt, and the Palestinians really disappear as a people at that point in 1948. The King of Jordan rules that the term Palestine can't be in any Jordanian history book, so they become in effect a stateless people, the Jews of the Middle East, you could say. Truman, after that, in 1949, still is trying to settle the issue of refugees and borders. But about August again of 1949, he just gives up, and that's the end of it. And he never does anything else about the issue for the rest of his presidency. Now, what are the conclusions I draw from this? The first conclusion, which I hope doesn't surprise you, is that I don't think the Morrison-Grady plan, the plan for a federation, was ever feasible. I don't think it would have worked. I don't think it was a realistic choice for two reasons. First, the one that you could, obviously see from the description of the 30s and the 40s, which is the two sides were at each other's throats, and even the UN plans were not feasible. They envisaged a common economy between the two sides and a kind of commons. And 1947-48, it is really hard to imagine the Arabs and the Jews of Palestine coexisting within any kind of federation or binational state. The only conceivable way in which that could have happened is if the United States had been willing to send troops and to enforce it and to pull the two sides apart. But that's the last thing Truman wanted to do. Initially, he was worried about demobilizing the troops. There was no support for beginning to mobilize again in 1945-46. After that, you get the Cold War. He's in 1948, when he's trying to decide what to do, whether to recognize a Jewish state. That's the time of the Berlin crisis, when many people in the administration believed that World War III was right on the horizon. So I don't think it was. I don't think I don't think the Morrison-Grady was a realistic plan. What I think is important to note about Truman and about the way he approached it is that his underlying principles are worth considering. First, the idea that whatever happens there, it has to be a settlement, a plan that is fair to both sides, not just to the Jews but also to the Arabs. Fair, a moral issue. That was again, important to Truman, and I think it's important to me as well as I look upon what should happen there. The second thing was that he, like other people in the State Department, was worried about the wars and continual decades of wars, and as you know, that's exactly what happened. So I think that the urgency he felt to achieve some kind of a settlement, some kind of a reconciliation, some kind of a deal there that was fair to both sides and that would establish stability and long-lasting peace were noble principles, and they're ones that should guide us today as well. So that's really what I take from the Truman story. You can ask me whatever you want.